My name is Pawel. I'm working as an iOS developer. I'm doing actually iOS apps for over 4 years, and today I would like to talk to you about a very important topic, which is accessibility, and how can we actually adjust our apps for accessibility with a technology which is called VoiceOver. So this talk is divided into 4 parts, and the first one is an introduction to accessibility and the VoiceOver technology. After that, we'll do so-called accessibility audit, which will be like a state of our application's accessibility. So I've actually prepared a demo app for that. We will go through this app, and we will see how accessible it is out of the box without any accessibility features implemented by myself. After that, we'll talk about improving the accessibility of our apps, because actually the reason why are we doing accessibility audits is to find out what are the issues with accessibility in our apps. So we'll talk about the ways that we can improve it. We'll identify those issues, and we'll just use the standard SDK to improve the user experience for VoiceOver users. And after that, I have a couple of slides regarding good accessibility practices. So we're gonna learn a little bit about VoiceOver and visual accessibility today. So I just wanted to summarize that in a couple of slides and present them to you. Okay, so let's start with the introduction. So when we want to talk about accessibility, and particularly VoiceOver, first of all, we need to actually define what accessibility means. And accessibility is just like a area of knowledge, which is basically about adjusting our apps to the needs of disabled people. And when it comes to accessibility and defining accessibility, there are 2 important things to notice. First of all, there are like 4 main areas of accessibility, being cognitive and learning, hearing, motor, and vision. Today we're gonna focus on the last one. And also, I just wanted to tell you that actually many of the products coming from Apple family, basically all of them, operating systems, devices, etc., like iOS, macOS, watchOS, or tvOS are accessible by default. So they are actually providing a great experience for the users who want to take advantage of that for all groups of users. And by adjusting them, adjusting their settings, we can actually provide the great experience for everyone. But of course, it's not only the operating system, it's not only the device, it's also the apps. So we as developers are actually a central part of providing the user experience to the end user. And that's also as well our opportunity to care about accessibility. So why should we do that? First of all, I think that there are not many apps on the market which are actually adjusted to the needs of disabled people, and that's pretty sad fact. So it's actually very beneficial for us as developers as well to do that, because sometimes we are creating a solution which is already existing on the market with some competitive apps. And we want to make this application really stand out. So one of these actually ways that we can do that is to give accessibility features for this app. And most importantly, I think that we're doing something good. So we're actually using the technology to enrich someone else's experience, which is a very good thing to do on its own. So yeah, accessibility can be very beneficial, and the disabled users who are actually taking advantage of our apps can recommend those apps to their friends who are actually suffering from the same disabilities. So it's worth to do that. So the technology we're gonna talk about today is VoiceOver. And VoiceOver is nothing more than a gesture-driven screen reader, which is built in many operating systems from Apple. So it's built in macOS, it's built on iOS. We're gonna focus on iOS today, but it's also on watchOS and on tvOS. VoiceOver is localized, so it's language dependent. So you can use VoiceOver when your phone language is set to English, when it's set to German, when it's set to French, when it's set to Polish. VoiceOver basically, since it's a screen reader, it reads the content like a book. So in our case, it works from top left, bottom right, but for example, in Arabic languages, it works from top right to bottom left. So to enable VoiceOver and take advantage of that, we can go to Settings, General, Accessibility, and VoiceOver. And this little switch that we can see on top actually enables VoiceOver. But bear in mind that actually enabling VoiceOver dramatically changes the way that we are interacting with our iPhone. So it's no longer like we doing a single tap to select an action. It's no longer that we are just like swiping with one finger to scroll. It's completely different. And from this moment, we are tapping once to select an item, tapping twice to select an action, and swiping with 3 fingers. So since the navigation is completely different, I would not recommend you to do it this way because it may be sometimes difficult to turn it off. So instead, we can use accessibility shortcuts, and we can go to Settings, General Accessibility, scroll to the bottom, set accessibility shortcut to VoiceOver, and from this moment, when we triple click on the home button or on the side button iPhone 10, the VoiceOver can be either enabled or disabled. So when we have VoiceOver on, there are just like a couple ways to navigate, to switch between elements that the interpreter detects on our screen. And we can do that with single tap, like mentioned earlier. So we can just like tap on any area on the screen, and if there is under our finger, there is like an element that can be interpreted by VoiceOver, the VoiceOver will read its description. We can also take one finger and slide along the screen, so actually the VoiceOver interpreter will follow the movement of the finger and read all the elements that our finger is actually following. Or we can flick left and right and switch between next and previous element. And that's the way that visually impaired people are usually using VoiceOver. So that's probably the most important type of navigation. When we are using VoiceOver, it's also important to take advantage of the rotor. So when the VoiceOver is enabled, we can use a predefined sets of elements on the screen and jump quickly through them. And Rotor is exactly for that. So we can take 2 fingers and rotate them a little bit to perform just like a manual dial gesture, and it will enable the rotor. So we can switch between, for example, headings, containers, or we can also use Rotor to use any other predefined behavior, like for example, speech rate. And by flicking one finger up and down, we can just like jump between different elements that are compatible with the specific rotor. Rotors are very actually useful on the VoiceOver navigation, and they are also useful for developers as well, since iOS 10, there is a API that we can create custom rotors in our apps. So if you're actually filtering some kind of content, it can be useful to think about implementing your own rotors. So if we know the basics of VoiceOver, and if we know how can we actually navigate and use that, then we can audit our app for accessibility, for VoiceOver accessibility. And accessibility audit is just like a statement, a manifest of our app openness to this wide range of users. And bear in mind that actually when speaking about accessibility and speaking about VoiceOver, I'm referring mostly to the visually impaired users, because accessibility covers that big spectrum of disabilities that we won't be able to cover them all on this talk today. But we can perform an accessibility audit, and this audit can be either automatic or manual. And it's a very good practice to always perform a manual audit, since actually automatic can be generated by the accessibility inspector in Xcode, but it doesn't always actually find out these all areas that may require improvements. So actually doing manual access and using the app like a person who actually cannot see or can see partially is much more beneficial when understanding our app's accessibility. So to do the accessibility audit, you just need to open your app, turn on VoiceOver, navigate through various areas of your app to see how accessible they are, and see if they're giving you enough context, if they're described enough well, and if the navigation is still simple. Because when we are creating our apps for non-VoiceOver users, we always strive for the simple navigation, and we want to preserve the same user experience for all kinds of users. So it should be also simply accessible and simple to navigate on VoiceOver as well. So I create this little app for the presentation purposes, and it's called Tweety. So it's like a Twitter client. And on the screen, we can see a couple of areas. And this frame, you can see around this settings button is actually the VoiceOver focus area. So what we're doing right here, we're just like jumping through all the elements on the screen by flicking here with your finger to the right side, and the VoiceOver will jump from the previous element to another, starting from top left, ending on bottom right. So to do that now, I will give you a quick commentary of what is the value being read by VoiceOver on certain elements.
Item, button.
It reads item, button.
Item, button. Tweety, heading.
Tweety, heading,
Button.
button.
All the man hours.
Is name and surname, but without context, and the same with button.
Author,
Author, first
first name,
name, last name, when, 2 days ago, the description of the tweet.
Sport, etc. Your abuse is the same vocabulary. The languages only differ in their grammar, their pronunciation, and their most common words. When, 2 days ago.
When, 2 days ago.
Free, button.
Free, button. 6, button. Button. And when we are jumping between other tweets, we need to jump also through those buttons which are associated to this tweet. So if we want to jump quickly, you can see that we have to flick a little bit to actually go through the list. So what's the state of the app? The buttons on the top, the bar button items, are not very accessible. So for example, if I can't see the settings button, if I hear items button, I don't know what that is. I don't know what's the context of this element. The same thing with the notifications button. VoiceOver tells me only that it's a button, but what is that button for? What's its purpose, right? I mean, it's clearly visible that if I can open it, I will go to the notification screen. There's one unread notification over there, but the voice user cannot hear that from the context. When we are going to this top area with the photo and the name and the surname and the Twitter handle, we can hear firstly the name and surname being read, and that's not that bad, but we don't know what's the action behind it. So when we jump to the next element, which is actually a button, we can hear that it's a button. So probably it will trigger some action. It will go to our profile when we actually select that action. Then we go to the tweets, to the cells, and on the cells we can see the content. So it firstly reads author, first name and the last name, and probably this author is not very necessary in this case because we can know from the context that when it reads the first name and the last name, that is actually the first name and the last name. And when it reads the whole description of this tweet, we are jumping through next elements, and we're jumping to those buttons on the bottom. And we can hear 0 button. So we don't know that's a like button, actually. It doesn't provide us this context. So if I could not see that button, if I didn't know that it's a hard icon, I would not know that's a like. And the same with retweet and the same with share. And finally, when we want to jump between different cells, navigate through them quickly, we need to go through these buttons one by one, so that's not very accessible as well. So the result of this one screen application is 5 areas that we need to improve when it comes to actually implementing VoiceOver. So once again, bar button items do not have any context for VoiceOver users. Go to profile area doesn't tell the user that it's a button. Some of the label provide unnecessary information, like for example this author or when it was submitted. So actually we don't need those headers, we just need the information. First name, last name, 2 days ago. Action buttons do not have description and contain only numbers. So it's about those like, retweet buttons, etc. Navigating between posts is difficult because I have to flick 4 times to jump to another cell. So let's take a look at one of the controls that we want to improve. The notifications button. So we can see there's a bell. It has one unread notification, and when we want to improve its accessibility for the voiceover interpreter, for the accessibility interpreter, we need to ask ourselves 4 very important questions. And the first one is, do I serve a purpose? So it's regarding the control. Does the control serve a purpose? So in this case, it's like a question, is it important for the user? So it probably is. It is in this case, because I'm sure that if the voiceover user would know that there are just like one new notification waiting for him, he will be tempted to check what's underneath it. So we need to give this context, but to need this context, to give this context, we firstly need to expose actually this control to VoiceOver, and we are doing that by answering to this question. Second one is, what are you? And it answers that I am a button. So we actually know what kind of actions we can expect from this control. So it is a button, so we can actually, when we perform an action on it, it may actually do equivalent of the tap action. When it is, for example, an adjustable control like slider, it changes the value. So we need that information as well. The next one is, what's your name? And the answer is notifications. So basically the context of this control is notifications. We can give a name like notifications button, but the names should be actually very simple and very descriptive. And we don't need this button part because we answered in the previous question. That is in fact a button. And the last very important question is, what's your value? And in this case, it's one unread, since we know that already that is a button, a notifications button, and has one unread notification. That's its value. So to summarize all those questions, the flow looks exactly like that, and all of these questions and all of these answers can be represented as properties from the UIAccessibility protocol. And we're gonna go by them one by one. So the first question, do you serve a purpose? It's actually represented by a Boolean flag. It's accessibility element. So when this value is set to true, the voiceover interpreter can recognize this element. When it's a value set to false, it cannot. Simple as that. Next one, who are you? And we are giving these traits, this combination of accessibility traits for a control that actually describe what's the action, what can be expected from using that control. And there are many, many different traits that we can combine and use. So button is just like one of them. There are traits like none, which is default actually value. Button, link, search field, image, selected, adjustable, like I was telling you about the slide, or for example, header. There are many, many other traits, and actually some of the traits are very important for the rotors. So if you want to use the predefined rotors, remember about giving appropriate traits for your controls. And some of them can have exclusive API methods. So for example, adjustable. So when we are using a slider and we are giving this slider an adjustable trait, if we want to change the value that is actually updated with every usage of this control. So for example, let's take a slider for volume, for example. And if we want to define that with every usage of the slider, we can increase the volume by 5 or by 10 or 15 or whatever. So we can actually want to define the step of the slider, we can use methods like accessibility increment or accessibility decrement, and these methods can be used only with the adjustable property. Otherwise, they don't work. Okay, next question, what's your name? My name is notifications, so that's a value that is represented by accessibility label. That's the first value that is being read by the VoiceOver interpreter. It should be short, it should be precise, it should just give you context in a very short way. So, like I told you, notifications button, maybe not the best idea, but notifications is good enough. It's very simple, it's very descriptive. And it should be localized. Because like I've told you, VoiceOver is localized by itself, so also the strings that we are using, I did not localize this for the sake of simplicity, but of course you should do that in the production apps. Last question, what's your value? My value is one unread, so when it actually reads what's behind this control. If we would use the same button with VoiceOver after implementing all of these properties, it would read something like notifications, button, one unread. So we have all the context right now. So we're just like, if there is some kind of state associated to your element, which should be exposed to VoiceOver, just use the value property to update this element and remember about localized strings. So the UIAccessibility protocol is responsible for exposing all of that. And UIAccessibility protocol is just like an informal protocol providing a set of accessibility properties. And to make our elements accessible, we just use those properties, which are defined in this protocol. We can use also notifications, methods. So I highly encourage you to actually go to the documentation and take a look what's inside it. But those parts are the most important ones from the beginning. And use appropriate context and description just to remember that your control should be as clearly visible for the users who cannot see as for the users who can see it. So mentioned properties, the four mentioned previously, are the most important to be used on the way of making your element accessible. But what if it's not enough, okay? So we have also other properties. Maybe we need some wider range of customizations. First of all, I wanted to tell you that every UI kit control has a default value for one of those properties, maybe not all of them. Maybe value is actually, accessibility value doesn't have like a default value for all states. But for example, if we create a new button and we give it a title, then the isAccessibility element property is set as true, and its label, accessibility label is actually its title. So as long as you are using standard UI kit control, you have some accessibility behavior for free. So all you need to do is just like go with your accessibility audit and maybe adjust some of them. So I did not do any of the accessibility work regarding of those controls on the accessibility audit, but you could see that some of them were at least recognizable by VoiceOver. I'm just gonna give them appropriate context. If that's not enough, if those four properties are not enough, there are just like many different ones. So for example, accessibility frame or accessibility path, which actually dictates what's the frame covering the accessibility area. There is accessibility hand. It's an additional value, also a localized string. So after the VoiceOver speaker stops reading, it takes a short pause and actually reads accessibility hint, where you can provide some kind of additional information of what's the action behind it. You can use accessibility view as model. So for example, if you are using a UI view covering part of the screen and you want this UI view to act like a model, then you can use this one to make sure that what's underneath this view is not going to be interpreted by VoiceOver, only the content of this view. So it's working with UI views, actually. If you are using a UI view controller with model presentation, you have this behavior for free as well. And there are many others. So when it comes to accessibility protocol, just deep dive to it and take a look and see what's already in there. But what we want to improve is actually the experience. And we need to think about context and simplicity. So this example, this actually one cell is coming from the medium app. And actually, we can identify some areas that this one is using at least controls, which can be at least 8 controls, which can be exposed to VoiceOver. So if you want to jump quickly between the cells, we can go through, I don't know, maybe even 8 elements one by one by flicking the button, and then we are actually jumping to another cell. So it's the same case as I had with Tweety. And so think about the context. So what we see here is not that we see actually a group label, suggested topic label, whatever, that we see, for example, the name of the article or the description or the author. We actually see an article preview. And we need to treat this element as a whole thing, as an article preview. So instead, just try to expose to VoiceOver this area, just like a single article preview. Don't think about, these elements one by one. Just try to think how you interpret this element. And you interpret this, like I said, as an article preview. So try to expose it as an article preview. But OK, in this case, these 2 buttons won't be accessible. I will tell you how to fix that in a moment. So outside UIKit, like I told you previously, when you are using standard UIKit controls, you have this accessibility behavior for free. But for example, what if I'm doing some core graphics drawing? What if I'm creating my own custom UI elements? You can use a wrapper around it, and I'm going to tell you about it in a moment. But bear in mind that anything that's not an UI control doesn't have a default value for these properties. So it's not going to be accessible, and actually the properties I've been telling you about a moment ago are not that actually out of the box as they were with UI controls. So if we want to make our custom drawing accessible, we can use the UIAccessibility element API. So it works like that. We have this UI view, which is container for presenting our custom drawing, whatever content. And we can wrap our content around this UIAccessibility element instances and add them to the container. So when it's actually visible but not interpreted by VoiceOver, just use this API. Treat your UI view, which is presenting the information, as a container. Don't make your UI view, don't make your container accessible, just make the sub-elements accessible thanks to the UI accessibility element properties. And you can do that for different purposes. If you, for example, have like a area that needs to be consolidated into one element, like I saw you on this case with cells, you can use that as well. So it's not only for non-UIKit elements, it's just like to define your custom accessible elements for VoiceOver and other accessibility engines. Okay, so of course, if you define it, you need to provide all of these values. So for example, you have to set its accessibility element to true, you have to give appropriate label, you have to give appropriate traits, you have to give appropriate value, hint, whatever. Also, you need to provide the frame, because the VoiceOver interpreter won't detect the frame on its own. So you have to actually use that frame or path, or in this case, frame and container space property. So the difference is that, for example, if you want to use frame or path, these are providing coordinates in the screen area. And when you are using accessibility frame and container space, you are providing the frame inside your container. So you can either use this API, the older one, the frame, but you have to remember they are giving the screen coordinates, or you can use frame and container space property and actually focus on the placement inside your container. The only difference is that actually the new API frame and container space property is available since iOS 10, and the first one is very, very old, it's since iOS 3, I believe. But Apple also provides some translation methods if you're using the older one. So there are also custom actions. So like I told you previously on the example, we had this case when we are just like covering this area, and probably these two buttons would not be accessible anymore because we just like to want to provide this easy navigation and jump between certain cells with one flick, but we still want to preserve, right, the action of these buttons. So on this case, we still want to be able to add this article to our bookmarks or do whatever it is behind this free dot control. In case of tweeting, we still want to be able to like this tweet or retweet it or share it, but we don't want to go through these actions one by one by flipping if we want to navigate quickly. And you can use custom actions for that. So custom actions are for defining your behavior, which actually is changed by VoiceOver. So if you have, for example, custom gesture recognizers or doing swiping a lot, since the swiping mechanism has changed, you can define custom actions, and it works like that, that when the VoiceOver interpreter starts, VoiceOver speaker starts speaking, actually, it takes a short pause and says that there are actions available. And you can select through these actions with one finger flick up and down, and select one of those and tap with double tap and select that action. So it actually lets you preserve this simple UI and provide all the necessary actions as well. So based on all of this knowledge, I went to Tweety and I've implemented all of these actually behaviors in it. And let's see how our experience improved when it comes to accessibility. So right now, this element reads Settings button. Tweety heading. Notifications, one unread button. User profile, first name, last name, button. First name, last name, 2 days ago. The content of the tweet. It's pretty long.
Pronunciation and their most common words. Button. Actions available.
Actions available. What are the actions? Like. Retweet. Share. So you can swipe, flick with one finger and select one of the actions, and then do double tap and just like perform this action. But look how easy it is to navigate right now. It's just like a one flick from left to right, and you're just like jumping between different elements. So with this couple of APIs, with the simplest APIs, we actually managed to solve all of the issues that we had with this app's accessibility. So it doesn't take a lot of knowledge to actually do that. When performing an audit, you can also use the Accessibility Inspector. This is a built-in Xcode tool, and you can go to Xcode Developer Tools, Accessibility Inspector, and open your app, go to the second section on the right side, which is this exclamation mark, and run the audit. And it will provide you with some information that you can improve when it comes to your application's accessibility. Maybe you will not think about some of those during the manual audit, so it's always recommended to do the manual and the automatic as well. But please, please, always do at least the manual, because it's the most beneficial one. To summarize our good accessibility practices, what we want to learn from this presentation is that we should design and test with accessibility in mind. We need to perform both automatic and manual audit for our apps. We need to keep VoiceOver strings like labels, value, hints fully localized, short and clear, because like I said, VoiceOver is working in many, many languages. Ensure that VoiceOver correctly represents visual context of your element, like for example with this notification button. Group elements, use custom actions and rotors to simplify navigations, like for example with the case with the tweets. And provide great user experience for all kinds of users. So that's a very important slide, but I have one which is much more important. So if I would like to you all to just like remember one slide from this presentation, this slide is coming right now, and it looks like this. And it's completely dark, it's completely empty. And that's probably the way that VoiceOver user sees your application. So you have to keep that in mind. So when you are doing accessibility audit, like we did right there, we were actually able to see this context, and we were actually able to understand it, even if we are not VoiceOver users, because okay, yeah, that's how it is. But what if the user cannot see? You can ask yourself, is my app really accessible? So in other words, can I use it with my eyes closed? And you can do that. So there's one feature I haven't mentioned to you, and I would like to show it to you right now, which is called the screen curtain. So it's basically about enabling VoiceOver.
VoiceOver on. Photos.
Okay. I did that, and...
App switcher. Speech off. Speech on.
Sorry?
VoiceOver off.
Okay. We're back. So when we enable VoiceOver,
VoiceOver on. Photos.
and we take 3 fingers and triple tap,
Row 1. Speech off.
it actually can dim and show content of our display. So when we are doing a manual audit, when we want to check if our app is really accessible, I will highly recommend you to do that. Just like enable the screen curtain, and your screen will go completely black, so you won't be able to see anything, and then perform the manual audit. So you're gonna know what the real context is. So if you want to learn about accessibility and VoiceOver and providing great user experience for everyone, you can go to those links. Probably the most important one is actually Apple's page on accessibility. But you can go to other organizations. For example, this company like Decway is working on providing many great accessibility experiences for both web and mobile. Twitter is a really great accessibility advocate. They're doing great stuff in terms of actually making their apps accessible to everyone. And Twitter is a great example of an app that is actually accessible. And there is a talk from this year's WWDC, Talk 226, which is mostly about testing and actually adjusting your apps to the needs of visually impaired users. It's not that very about coding, it's more about VoiceOver and doing the audits and how it helps other people. So I will highly recommend you to watch this one as well. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Have you heard, first of all, great speech. I always encourage anyone who follows the accessibility path, makes us aware of the problems that we usually don't have, but some of our users do. Have you heard of a haircut effect?
No.
Okay, so it's kind of deep of knowledge, so I'm gonna give a lightning talk next time.
Okay.
So then again, next question. Facebook uses its own AI to kind of describe what's on the picture.
Yeah.
So, for example, if I made you a picture, Facebook would tell me, at least on their website, there is a man, there is a plotter, and he's giving a speech.
Yeah.
Do you know any publicly accessible, even paid API that would allow me to use my pictures and allow my app to tell someone?
Sure. Okay, so first of all, VoiceOver doesn't by default, because since iOS 11, I believe, you can, for example, go to the Photos app and enable VoiceOver and do a 3-finger tap on the picture. It will describe some of the picture traits. So you can detect faces, it can actually interpret some text, and tell you what's the, for example, lightness or blurriness of the photo, or what the emotions on the faces. But there are also other third-party APIs, like, for example, Microsoft has one. I don't remember the name right now, but I remember that we were using that in the company where I work. So it's mostly actually about this machine learning based on pictures, right? So you are sending a picture to the API and it returns you a string with some kind of level of being sure that it's actually describing this kind of situation.
I guess the authorization keeps parameters about the culture that will get paid
Sorry, I didn't get it. Could you, because I've heard about that.
The parameter you are sending the us to the culture, so the API gives you the data in the right language.
Not sure which app you are referring to, because if we are talking, yeah, the Microsoft one. Yeah, so you're basically sending a picture, and it's like machine learning, right? So it describes what it sees on the picture.
Does what data localized to the language, the right language? Is there a parameter?
I believe there is. I'm not that sure right now, but I think there is.
It's more of like a free-form question.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to know your opinion on that. Should accessibility in general be only the concern of a developer, or should you encourage, for example, your UX designer?
Yeah, definitely.
And really make the app accessible.
Definitely. I think that when we are creating products, we are creating products, right? So we are going through these different phases of, development, but also of design and UX and also testing. So if you have designers, UX designers in your companies, or testers, manual testers, be an accessibility advocate and encourage them to actually think about all of those features, because we all are responsible for delivering great product and great experience for everyone. So it's not only developers actually a responsibility. Okay, I guess that's it. So we can meet afterwards if you have any more questions, and thank you very much for coming and listening to this talk.